I won't be able to smoke this weekend. I've got my little nieces coming to stay and they get on at me about it.
Oh, Uncle Barry, you're making my asthma worse.
Just drains all the fun out of it.
The Smoking Room, addictive new comedy, starts on BBC Two, next Tuesday at 10.
This is BBC One for Kent and Sussex. Now the news, with Dermot Murnaghan, Sian Williams and Jeff Clark.
At 6 o'clock, one of Britain's most celebrated broadcasters, John Peel, has died. The DJ, who spent 4 decades in radio, suffered a heart attack while on holiday.
Also tonight, Israeli settlers' anger as Parliament votes on moving them out of the Gaza Strip.
The link between smoking and asthma, researchers say they found the strongest evidence yet.
Sir Mark Thatcher in court in South Africa. He denies financing an alleged coup plot.
And the men back home from fighting for America. In the second of our special reports, Raggy Omar goes to Iowa to see how the war on terror will affect the race for the White House.
Today's main news in the southeast. A family mourned the death of a 6-year-old girl after a blaze in her own home, and a man who suffered a heart attack after he'd been turned away at a doctor's surgery.
Good evening, welcome to the 6 o'clock news.
First tonight, tributes have been paid to one of the music industry's most influential figures. John Peel, whose radio career spanned nearly 40 years, died suddenly of a heart attack while on holiday in Peru. He was 65. John Peel was BBC Radio 1's longest-serving DJ and was passionate about promoting new music. Here's Nick Hyam.
Still sounds pretty good to me, I must say. Those are the adverts from years and years ago.
His style was laid back, laconic, lugubrious, but underneath he was an enthusiast. He never lost his passion for music that was new, original, surprising. The Undertones' Teenage Kicks was his favourite record. The band were among scores, even hundreds, whose careers took off once John Peel championed their music on his late-night Radio 1 show. CDs and demo tapes poured in. He loved anything edgy and challenging, from punk to hip-hop.
We were all still at school and stuff, and we got a John Peel session, because I went and gave him the cassette when he was doing a roadshow one day. And so, you know, we were just these stupid kids from Sheffield. But we got, you know, without that, we probably would never have got any further. And I'm sure that has happened a lot of times.
Listen for me, John Ravencroft, when I have the honour of joining Bobby Davis and Kay nightly on KOMA.
The posh public schoolboy from the Wirral started in radio in America in the early 60s. The Liverpool accent and a new name came when he switched to the pirate Radio London in the North Sea. In 1967, he was one of the DJs who launched Radio 1. For years, he's been the only survivor of that original lineup.
Considerably tidier studio than you had last week.
He didn't think much of the rest of the station's output.
You don't learn anything at all from listening to it for an entire week. And the music, of course, is basically, I think, pretty dismal.
But in due course, he mellowed. He even became an institution.
He's been a voice of continuity for people of my age. We've grown up with him, really, and he's sort of part of the family. I feel like we've lost one of the family.
He worked from home with a studio at his Suffolk farmhouse, a family man with a wife, 4 children and several pets, and a perfect choice to present Radio 4's Home Truths about modern family life.
He seemed to have had quite a difficult childhood, quite lonely in some respects, a complicated set of relationships, particularly with his mum, and that contrasted vividly with the warmth and the humour you felt he had in his own family life, particularly the relationship with Sheila, who he used to call the pig. And because he talked so openly and amusingly about all of this, it encouraged listeners to write in with the most extraordinary range of stories about their own lives.
Few radio presenters triumph in such different types of programme, but John Peel did. It won him many awards, and all for doing something he loved.
I know I'm fabulously lucky. I mean, I do know that. Everything that I wanted when I was a kid. A job on the radio playing records that I like. And you try and getting lots and lots of free records. It's difficult to think what could be added to this to improve it.
Well, joining us now from another of our studios is a close friend and colleague of John Peel, fellow broadcaster Andy Kershaw. Andy, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Sean.
We've been hearing from a lot of people just how influential John Peel was. What do you think his biggest contribution to the music industry
I would
was?
say he was the single most important figure in the history of British rock music, and you know, I put him ahead, if you like, of Paul McCartney and John Lennon on that, because of his enthusiasm, his championing of the outsider, the underdog, the unpopular, until he made it popular enough to be in the mainstream. And he did it for so long in so many different styles of music as well, and he never lost that. He was still, as our old producer that we used to share, John Walters, once said of him, you know, the day that Peel hits puberty, we're all in trouble. And he was still like that at the age of 65.
Yeah,
It's an enormous loss, this, not just because we've lost a great bloke and a good friend, and you know, everybody felt they were John Peel's friend, but culturally it's a huge loss. If you're 16 years old in a band tonight, you know, in some far-flung part of Britain, you've lost a big chance, because your great cheerleader has gone, if you can put it that way.
And you, of course, have lost a close friend as well. Do you have one lasting memory?
Oh, I can't narrow it down to one. You know, there are so many. When I arrived at Radio 1 in the summer of 1985 as supposedly the hip young gunslinger, and I think John was a bit worried that they brought me in to replace him, because my goodness me, he got to 45 by then. And, you know, he could easily have rejected me. We shared this 8-foot by 8-foot office. And he took me in and he just encouraged me, and he became like a sort of rather exotic uncle. But there's loads of other things. You know, we used to just, aside from music, we used to go away together to the Isle of Man TT races. Yeah, and I think it would be something like the pair of us standing in the field in driving rain, peering over a dry stone wall, watching midget Irishmen fling themselves around the island for our entertainment. And we were deliriously happy when we were doing that kind of stuff.
Andy Kershaw, thanks very much.
Israeli.
This is BBC One for Kent and Sussex. Now the news with Jeff Clark and Beverly Thompson.
Fatal fire. A family mourned the death of a 6-year-old girl at her Sussex home. Heart complaint. The man who had a heart attack shortly after he was turned away from the doctors.
Also tonight, high hopes for a Kent estate. A 1960s development prepares for regeneration. Peter Whittlesey is live in Ashford on the eve of demolition. Claire's challenge. She's survived meningitis and learned to walk again. Now she's taking on the marathon. And Pigeon Power, Commando's wartime medal, is up for grabs. Good evening and welcome to
The woman says she was suffering from a head injury when she was attacked. They claim she consented to sex.
Also tonight, death of a radio legend. John Peel suffers a fatal heart attack at 65.
He was a magician. He created something that was so personal for 5, 6 generations.
Mega profits, BP's staggering earnings, £1 million an hour. And child star, can 12-year-old Chesney bag another award?
Good evening. They are the figures.
Now, he was a champion of musicians and a true friend of the listener, just one of the many tributes to the radio legend John Peel, who's died of a heart attack. He was 65.
Throughout a long career, he pushed back the boundaries of music, supporting fledgling bands from the Beatles to Joy Division. Our media correspondent, Nina Nanar, looks back at the man and his musical passion.
Well, again, millions of listeners. On tonight's programme, we have a session for you from new fast automatic daffodils.
His voice was unmistakable, his tones avuncular, but his musical taste decidedly cutting edge. John Peel was the DJ who passionately championed new bands, who would get thousands of demo tapes from hopefuls, building an extension at his home to house his massive collection.
I mean, if I were to stay up day and night, 7 days a week, doing nothing but listening to new records, I still couldn't keep up with it.
John Peel began working as a DJ after leaving Britain in the early 60s for America. When he returned in 67, it was to work on pirate radio and then on Radio 1.
A lot of what he was came into the programmes. There was no artifice there. And as a result of that, you thought, hang on a second, this is special. Plus, he worked. I've never known a man work so hard at finding new music all the time.
John Peel was voted #1.
His career would be defined by the bands he helped launch by giving them radio airplay, championing British acts throughout the decades. He was one of the first to play the Beatles in the US, and back home continued to promote new bands.
If you made decent music, then you got on his show, and that was what gave us the impetus to get going, get a group up, because we know John Peel will put us on, and lo and behold he did, and he championed us.
Hello and welcome to Home Truths. This week
in 1998 he became the presenter of Radio 4's Home Truths, as well as continuing his show on Radio 1. He'd been due to return to that next week. John Peel's death from a heart attack whilst on a break in Peru robs the industry of a unique broadcasting talent who simply loved music.
Well, joining me from our Westminster studio is DJ and former colleague of John Peel, Mike Reid. Now, Mike, the word legendary is much overused, I think we'd agree, but in John Peel's case, it really seems to have been true, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, it was. He was a social and cultural icon. I mean, he'd have laughed at were he now. Yeah, come on, Reid, social and cultural icon, for goodness sake. But he was, and he did so much for young bands. I mean, there are bands over the last 4 decades that owe him an awful lot, and bands that were still to come that thought, you know, John is my man. I mean, he played the left field stuff and he was cutting edge. Sometimes, you know, I thought he was delightfully perverse. He'd play something. I'd say, John, why are you playing that? He said, well, you know, it lasts for 30 seconds. It's a bit of a noise. So sometimes he was delightfully perverse, but he was always left field. He was always pushing. Everything else was main field. He pushed it. When it went main field, he let it go.
But it's a business, isn't it, that's so youth-obsessed. How did he manage to stay right at the top for so long?
I don't know. It's a testimony to what he did, how he did it, who he was, and his passion. He did listen to everything. If an artist sent him a CD, it wasn't thrown on the pile. He actually listened to it. He loved music. He was passionate about it. When I joined Radio 1, I remember our boss at the time looking at the two of us sitting next to each other, and he said, well, John, maybe Mike's going to be the new John Peel. And John said, there's nothing wrong with the old one, actually. And he was right. He always thought, well, maybe they're going to kick me out this year. But they never did. He was the final survivor of that original 1967 crew.
Yeah, very sad day, isn't it? Mike Reid, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mary.